They don't prepare you for the sounds. After 14 years as a psychiatric nurse, most of them on a crisis stabilization unit, you think you've heard it all. The shouts, the sobs, the relentless rhythmic pacing. But the sound of complete silence in a place that's never silent. That's a sound that gets under your skin and stays there. My name is Helen. This was on the Pines unit, a 10-bed pod for high observation cases. It was the kind of place where the air always hummed with someone's distress. The routine on Pines was built on predictable chaos. Meds at 7 o'clock, 12 o'clock, 17 o'clock, 22 o'clock, group therapy at 10 o'clock, 15-minute checks, always. My responsibility, particularly on the evening shift, was the medication pass and the pre-bedtime vitals. You learn to move with a calm, deliberate energy. You announce yourself. You explain everything, even to patients who seem too dissociated to hear you. It's a protocol. It's also a shield. Our patient in bed 4 was a woman named Lillian, admitted for a severe dissociative episode. She'd been found in her apartment, which she'd cleaned from top to bottom, scrubbing the walls until her fingers bled. She claimed she was preparing a room. She spoke in a soft, polite monotone, but her affect was utterly flat. No eye contact, her chart warned. Subject to sudden, prolonged cataleptic states. In layman's terms, she'd sometimes freeze mid-motion, like a statue, for minutes or even hours. We were to note the duration and any precipitating factors. The disturbance began on her third night. I was doing my 21 o'clock vitals round. Lillian was sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the blank wall. I went through my script. Lillian, it's Helen. I'm just going to take your blood pressure now. No response. I applied the cuff. As it inflated, she spoke, her voice still that same, placid monotone, but her words were clear. The man in room 12 doesn't like the magnesium. I paused. Room 12 was on the other side of the unit, a male patient with severe agitation. His labs had come back that afternoon, showing critically low magnesium levels, and the doctor had ordered a replacement for that evening. I'd helped hang the bag myself at 19 o'clock. The order was less than 3 hours old, and Lillian had been on this locked pod the entire time. She had no access to charts, to computers, to staff conversation. The doors to patient rooms were solid. You couldn't see in. Let's just focus on you, Lillian, I said, finishing her reading. She went cataleptic then, right as I removed the cuff, her hands suspended in midair. It lasted 27 minutes. The next night, 21 o'clock, again. Same routine. This time, as I wrapped the cuff, she said, "The new nurse. James's wife's water broke at 7:46. It's a girl." James was a float nurse from the pediatric unit, pulled to us that night due to short staffing. He'd arrived at 19 o'clock, looking tense. At 21:30, during our handover, his phone buzzed. He went white, then broke into a grin. "It's happening. My wife, her water broke an hour ago. He'd been on our unit the whole time. He hadn't taken a call." When I later asked, discreetly, he confirmed the time his wife had called him. 7:46 p.m. Lillian had been cataleptic from 1845 until 2055. Asleep, for all clinical purposes. The escalation was a quiet, gathering dread. It wasn't fear of her, but fear of the mechanism. How was she hearing whispers through the vents? Was there some flaw in our privacy? We swept her room for devices. Found nothing. The staff began avoiding her room, speaking in hushed tones at the station. A superstitious fear, unprofessional but human, settled over the shift. Her catalepsy episodes grew longer. The impossible event happened on the night of her planned discharge. Her medication had stabilized her. She was brighter, making eye contact, talking about going home. Her final set of vitals, 20:55, I was almost relieved. She was present. She smiled at me. I placed the stethoscope on her back. "Deep breath for me, Lillian." She took the breath, and then, in that same flat, serene voice, she said, "You should check on your son, Helen. My blood went to ice. My son Leo was 8, home with my husband, safe in bed. She continued, her voice muffled by her own breath as I listened to her lungs. He's standing in his bedroom doorway. He's holding his blanket. He's afraid of the biplane. I jerked back as if scalded. My professional composure shattered. 1,000 explanations raced through my head, a lucky guess. A overheard snippet about my life, but they all crashed against one impossible detail. My son's deepest, most specific fear, one we'd never put in writing, never discussed with anyone but his pediatrician, was the vintage biplane mobile that had hung over his crib as a baby. He'd had night terrors about it for years. We'd removed it when he was 2. He hadn't mentioned it in over a year. I didn't finish the vitals. I mumbled something and left the room. I went to the staff phone and called home. My husband answered, confused. Yeah, he's fine. Well, he just came out to the landing a minute ago, said he had a bad dream, something about an old toy plane. I just got him back to bed. How did you know? Lillian was discharged the next morning. She thanked me for my care. Her eyes were clear, her handshake warm. She had no memory, she said, of most of her time with us. Just fog. The aftermath isn't a question of what she was. The aftermath is the erosion of a fundamental professional boundary. My shield wasn't just protocol. It was the belief that my inner life, the fears of my child, were mine, separate, contained. She proved that in a place of fractured minds, the partitions we take for granted between here and there, between patient and staff, between thought and secret, might be thinner than we can bear to admit. I still do the vitals. I still talk to my patients. But now, in the back of my mind, a small, cold part of me is listening. Not to them, but for the things they might somehow know about me. It wasn't my patient. That's the detail that changes things. In a locked behavioral health pod, you're a team, but you have your assignments, your own caseload, your own med passes, your own progress notes to file before shift change. It's a system designed for containment, both for them and for us. It keeps the responsibility clean. At least, that's what I believed before the incident with the CT machine. I was a senior psych nurse with 11 years and my shift was 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. on the acute assessment pod. We got the new admissions, the crises from the ER, the ones who needed constant watch while the doctors figured out the chemical puzzle. My patient that evening was in room 8, a young woman with severe, med-resistant OCD. Her ritual was counting. Not counting tiles or steps, but counting syllables. She'd listen to you speak, and her lips would move silently, tallying every sound you made. If the number was wrong, a concept only she understood, she'd enter a state of sheer silent panic. Your job was to sit, to speak in slow, measured sentences, and to wait out the storm. It was exhausting, precise work. Down the hall, in room 4, was a different kind of case. He was under the care of a junior nurse, Sam, a middle-aged man, post-catatonic, now in a state of residual schizophrenia. He was verbal, but flat. His affect was like still water. He'd been with us for 2 weeks. His only notable behavior was a preoccupation with the old clock on the wall of the day room, not watching it. He'd sit with his back to it. But if anyone mentioned time, he'd state, without inflection, "The scanner is cold." We assumed it was a loose metaphor, a fragment of delusion. The scanner was logged in his chart as a probable reference to the CT machine he'd been sent to in the general hospital for a neurology workup during his initial admission. A routine scan, clear results. It was a single line in a 40-page file. At 8:45 p.m., during the quiet hour before the night shift handover, the emergency line from radiology rang at the nurse's station. I picked it up. It was a tech, voice tight with confusion. The CT machine in the main hospital basement, room B12, was malfunctioning, not mechanically. The internal ambient temperature reading was dropping precipitously for no reason. It was reading 12 degrees Celsius and falling, They were about to shut it down. The reason for the call: the patient scheduled for the last slot of the evening, now cancelled, was one of ours. The name on the requisition form. It was my OCD patient in room 8. I checked the chart. There was no order for a CT scan. Not that day, not that week. I told the tech it was a mistake, a computer error. He insisted the form had been hand-delivered by a ward assistant hours ago. We had no ward assistant by that name. I hung up, my skin prickling. A strange admin mix-up, that's all. I walked down the hall to do my final check on room 8. As I passed the day room, the man from room 4 was sitting in his usual chair, back to the clock. He didn't turn. His voice, that flat, toneless drone, cut through the quiet. They tried to put her in the cold scanner. She doesn't like the number 7. I stopped. My breath caught. I turned to him. What did you say? He stared straight ahead, at the blank wall. Her counting. It stops at 6. The 7th syllable is the wrong number. The scanner is full of 7s. I stood there, frozen. He had never spoken to me. He had never, according to Sam's notes, initiated a conversation about anything other than the clock. He had no contact with my patient. Their schedules, their therapy sessions, their meal times all deliberately staggered. They were isolated pods in the same locked unit. I went to room 8. I opened the observation slit. The young woman was on her bed, rocking slightly. Her lips were moving, a frantic, silent cascade. She was counting. I watched, and against my professional judgment, I began to count the subtle movements of her jaw. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then a violent, silent shake of her head. A restart. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Shake. Again. She was stuck in a loop of 6. The cold CT machine. The erroneous requisition for her. His statement, the scanner is full of 7s. I never found the source of the requisition form. The tech couldn't describe the ward assistant who dropped it off. The machine returned to normal temperature an hour later. No one filed a formal incident report, because no incident, in the clinical sense, had occurred. Just a series of administrative glitches and a coincidental, bizarrely specific statement from a psychotic patient. I transferred to a different unit a month later, not out of fear, but out of a corroded certainty. We talk about patient confidentiality, about building separate therapeutic walls. We believe those walls protect them. But what if the illness, or the space inside the illness, doesn't respect those walls? What if information moves in ways we haven't charted? The horror isn't a ghost in the machine. It's the realization that the entire ward, the people, the schedules, the very equipment in a building a quarter-mile away might just be scenery. And the real landscape, the one where connections are made, is something we are not equipped to see, let alone document. Admissions, especially night intake, is less about therapy and more about forensic triage. You're a scribe for crisis. My name is David. I did intake coordination for a large urban hospital's psycher for 9 years. You see them brought in by police, by family, by ambulanza, parade of human fracture. The horror there isn't in jumps. It's in the paperwork. Specifically, in the inconsistencies that nobody has the time or the will to resolve. The routine was clockwork. Receive the transfer packet from EMS or PD. Log the patient into the system. Assign a temporary bed in the holding area. Perform a preliminary safety search. Collect belongings in a clear plastic inventory bag. You tag it. You initial it. You note every item on the property log. A watch, a ring, a set of keys. It's a legal document. It's also a gesture of trust. We will keep what is yours safe. The disturbance started with a man we'll call Mr. Vance, brought in by police after a welfare check. Neighbors reported screaming. Officers found him sitting calmly in a spotless living room, insisting the screams were from the people in the walls. Classic, tragic psychosis. He was compliant, almost relieved to be here. My partner Rita did the search while I logged the police report. Standard procedure. She called out items. 1 silver wristwatch, analog. 1 wedding band, gold. 47 cents in change. 1 house key on a blue fob. I wrote it down. Rita bagged it, tagged it, initialed the tag, RVI countersigned, DC. Mr. Vance was escorted to bed 7. The escalation was slow, a drip feed of clerical wrongness. An hour later, Rita was helping in the restraint of a different patient. I was at the desk finishing the intake forms for Mr. Vance. I pulled his property bag from the locked cabinet to double-check the list against my log. The items were there: watch, ring, coins, key, but the tag, the signature, where my initials, DC, should have been, was a different, looping script. MV Mr. Vance's initials. That was impossible. The tags are pre-printed with staff initial lines. Patients never touch them. The bags are sealed in front of them, then locked away. I showed Rita when she came back, sweating and tired from the restraint. She stared. That's not right. I signed it. You signed it. I watched you. We assumed a freak-era misprinted tag from a faulty batch. We reprinted a new tag, resealed the bag, signed it again. We noted the error in the incident log. A paperwork glitch. It happens. 2 nights later, a different patient. A young woman, catatonic, transferred from neurology after ruling out a stroke. Her belongings were a small purse. I performed the search myself. A wallet, a lip balm, a folded photograph of a gray cat. I bagged it, tagged it, signed it DC. I locked it away. When her family arrived an hour later to provide history, I retrieved the bag to show them we had her items secure. The tag, my signature, was gone. In its place, in a tight feminine handwriting that matched the Catherine R on her intake form, was KR. I felt the first real chill. I opened the bag. The items were correct. But tucked beside the photograph of the gray cat was a second, Polaroid-style picture I had never seen. It showed the same woman, Catherine, smiling in a sunlit garden. On the back, a date from 6 months prior, and the words, "A good day." I didn't show the family. I closed the bag. My professional mind raced through explanations. A neurological oddity, a dissociative fugue where she'd hidden the photo on her person, a missed pocket during the search. But the signature, the changed signature, that was a fact in the physical world, outside her mind. The impossible event was the quietest of all. It was a week later, with Mr. Vance. He had stabilized on medication. He was being discharged to a group home. I brought him his property bag for the final inventory check before release. We stood at the discharge counter. I unsealed the bag, spread the items. Watch, ring, coins, key. He nodded, meek, grateful. Then he picked up the house key on its blue fob. He looked at it, then at me. His eyes, now clear and medicated, held a profound confusion. "This isn't my key," he said, his voice soft. "It was on you when you came in, Mr. Vance. We logged it together." He shook his head, a slow, sure movement. "No, my key is on a red fob, a little leather red fob. My daughter gave it to me. This is *A, *key. But it's not my key." I checked the property log. I had written blue fob. Rita had called out blue fob. The police report made no mention of key fob color. It was his word against a document. But his certainty was absolute, and it was the certainty of a man now in his right mind. We discharged him with the key. What else could we do? After he left, I sat with the incident log, the property logs, the resealed bag from Catherine. The horror of admissions isn't the psychosis you see. It's the quiet, bureaucratic unreality that slips in alongside it. We document to create order. We sign our names to assert a shared objective truth. These things happened. these items are real. But what if the process itself is vulnerable? What if, in the presence of certain profound fractures in consciousness, the very artifacts of reality signatures, lists keys become unstable, not supernatural, pathological, a sickness that doesn't just inhabit a mind, but subtly warps the paper trail around it. I left admissions not long after that. I work in outpatient care now. I still do paperwork, but I never just sign my name. I stare at it for a second after the ink dries, making sure it hasn't already changed into something else. I don't know if I made a mistake on the 15th of October, or if I simply noticed one that had been made a long time before I got there. My name's Michael. I was a night shift mental health technician on a locked adult observation unit for 7 years. It was the kind of place where the most important part of your job was the 15-minute checks. You'd walk the dimmed hallways with your clipboard, peering through the safety glass windows in the doors, marking down that every patient was breathing, in their bed, safe. It was monotonous. It was the heartbeat of the place. Room 7 held a man named Arthur, catatonic, withdrawn type. He'd been admitted after being found standing in the middle of a 4-lane highway at 3 a.m., utterly still. He never spoke. He rarely moved. He'd sit in a chair by his window during the day, and at night, he'd lie flat on his back in bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. For months, my check on him was the same, 2,300. Patient supine, eyes open, respirations even. The irregularities started quietly. It was a documentation thing. The day shift notes began to include a single, odd line about Arthur. Patient reports discomfort with room temperature. It was written for 3 days straight. I remember reading it and feeling a cold kind of confusion. Arthur didn't report anything. He hadn't uttered a word in over a year. I asked the day nurse about it. She shrugged, said maybe a day tech had misinterpreted a shiver or something, and she'd address it. The note stopped appearing. Then, on a Tuesday night at 2:11, during my rounds, I saw it. Arthur was in his habitual position, on his back, eyes open, but his right hand was resting on his chest, his index finger extended. And on the condensation of the window beside his bed, he had drawn, very faintly, a small circle. It was already fading. My first thought was a frantic checklist. Had he been like that at the 1:45 check? I was sure he hadn't been. Was this new motor activity? A seizure post-ictile state? I documented it as possible purposeful movement observed, and notified the charge nurse. We watched him on the video monitor for the rest of the shift. He didn't move again. The next night it was 2:11 again. I made a point of being at his door exactly on the quarter hour. He was in the same position. His finger was on his chest. On the window, in the same patch of condensation, were 3 vertical lines, like a tally mark. This time, I went in. I said his name. No response. I checked his pupils. Nothing. His skin was cool. The room, like all rooms, was kept at a constant 72 degrees. As I left, I wiped the mark from the glass with my sleeve. It became a terrible, private ritual. For the next 6 nights, at precisely 2:11, I would watch from the hallway as Arthur's hand would rise slowly from his side, place a single finger on his sternum, and hold it there for exactly 1 minute. By 2:12, his hand would be back at his side, and each night, on the window a new mark would appear, a second tally, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth. On the 7th night, I didn't go to his door. I stood at the nurse's station, watching his room feed on the black and white monitor. The clock ticked to 2:11. On the screen, Arthur's hand rose. It placed a finger on his chest. At 2:12, it lowered. I walked down the hall, my footsteps too loud. I looked through the safety glass. The window was covered in them. Not just the 7 tallies from the past week. Dozens, scores, hundreds of tiny, faint tally marks layered over one another, filling the entire pane. They looked old, etched into the glass itself. It was impossible. That window was cleaned daily. I had wiped it clean myself the week before. The impossible event wasn't the marks. It was what happened when I finally looked away from the window and to Arthur's face. His eyes, always fixed on the ceiling, were turned toward the door. Toward me, and in the flat, streetlight glow from the window, I saw his lips were chapped, his mouth slightly dry. He whispered a single word, so faint it was less a sound and more a shape in the air: cold. I called a rapid response. The flurry of activity that followed vitals, assessments, a stat medication review erased at the moment. By the time the doctor arrived, Arthur's eyes were back on the ceiling, his body rigid and silent. They diagnosed a possible complex partial seizure cluster. They changed his medication. The window was thoroughly cleaned. Arthur never moved or spoke again. He was transferred to a long-term facility a month later. I never spoke about the tallies, or the time, or the word. It wouldn't have been in my scope to speculate. But sometimes, during the quietest part of the night shift, I'll catch myself calculating. A tally is a count, a record. If you did one tally a night, how many nights would it take to cover a window? And what, in a place where time is measured in 15-minute increments, could possibly be worth counting for that long? I don't believe in ghosts in the walls. I believe in consciousness trapped in a chemical cage. And I am very, very careful about what I write in the documentation now. Because you never know who might be reading it, tallying it, from a place inside where you can't see them. I'm not supposed to remember this one as clearly as I do. It happened on a night that should have blended into all the others, but instead it left a mark I still feel when I signed certain forms. I was working admissions that winter, 12 years in by then, mostly nights. The unit was a locked acute ward attached to a general hospital, 8 rooms. Constant observation protocols, nothing unusual on paper. My job was intake, initial safety checks, documentation, and flagging anything that might complicate the first 72 hours. I liked nights because they were quieter, fewer eyes, fewer opinions, fewer mistakes. The first note I remember is the timestamp, 1:47 a.m. I had just finished reconciling the med cart after shift change when transport called to say they were bringing someone up from the emergency department. Voluntary admission, mid-30s, male, brought in by family for non-responsive behavior. That phrase gets used loosely. It can mean a lot of things: exhaustion, dissociation, catatonia. Sometimes it just means someone refuses to talk. When he arrived, he looked like someone who had already given up on explaining himself. Eyes open, unfocused, breathing shallow but steady. He didn't resist the wheelchair transfer. He didn't assist either. Dead weight, but not unconscious. The ed paperwork said he'd been like that for at least 6 hours. No drugs in his system, CT clear, vitals stable. Routine intake followed. Room 3 was open. I remember that because I hesitated before assigning it. Room 3 had the best camera angle, no blind spots, which is where we placed patients who might require constant observation. I signed him in, verified his name, date of birth, next of kin. I asked the questions we required to ask even when we know we want to get answers: suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts, hallucinations, pain. He didn't respond to any of it. Not verbally, not physically. Not even a blink that suggested he was tracking my voice. We documented him as catatonic features, placed him on one-to-one observation until psych could evaluate in the morning. I wrote that his eyes appeared open but unresponsive, that he did not follow commands, that there was no verbalization. I've written that sentence hundreds of times. The rest of the ward settled into its normal rhythm: call lights, toileting, a patient pacing the hallway muttering about numbers, another crying quietly into a pillow. Nothing that would stand out later if you read the log. At 2:11 a.m., I did my first camera sweep after intake. Room 3 showed him exactly as we'd left him supine, eyes open, chest rising. The observer sat outside the door, charting every 15 minutes like protocol required. Nothing flagged. At 2:26, the observer wrote, "Patient remains still. Eyes open. No change." At 2:41, same note. At 2:58, the note changed slightly. Patient blinking intermittently. That happens sometimes. Catatonia isn't always absolute. I didn't think much of it. What I did notice, and didn't write down, was that the blinking wasn't random. It was regular. Every few seconds, like he was keeping time with something. At 3:14 a.m., I went to do a physical check. Camera observation is standard, but we're trained not to rely on it entirely. I stood at the foot of the bed and said his name. No response. I said it again, louder. Nothing. I moved to his side, shined a pen light briefly to check pupillary response. Normal. I told him I was going to adjust his blanket. No resistance. As I turned to leave, he spoke. It was quiet, dry, like he hadn't used his voice in a long time. "You're going to forget to lock the medication room." I froze. That happens to patients breaking through catatonia with brief, disorganized speech. We're taught not to react, not to reinforce. I turned back, asked him to repeat himself. He didn't. His eyes stayed fixed on the ceiling. His breathing never changed. I documented the verbalization that's important. Anytime a non-responsive patient speaks, it goes in the chart. I wrote the exact words, timestamped 3:16 a.m. Then I went back to the desk. At 3:22, the unit alarm sounded. The medication room door was open. That shouldn't have been possible. It's a double lock system, badge access plus a physical key. I checked my pockets immediately. My keys were still there. No one else had been near it. The observer hadn't moved. Cameras showed no traffic. We treated it as a procedural lapse. That's how everything gets handled at first. I secured the room, ran an inventory, nothing missing. I wrote an incident note about an unsecured door. I did not mention what the patient had said. There's no place for that in official documentation. I told myself it was coincidence, fatigue, pattern seeking. At 4:05 a.m., the observer charted. Patient vocalized earlier. Currently non-responsive, eyes open. At 4:19, I did another camera sweep. Room 3 looked unchanged, except his eyes were no longer fixed on the ceiling. They were angled slightly to the left, toward the door. At 4:27, without prompting, he spoke again. "You charted me at 16. I was standing outside the room when he said it." The observer looked at me first, eyebrows raised, waiting for instruction. I stepped in, asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. His eyes drifted back up. I checked the chart, the intake note, the verbalization entry, 3:16 a.m. He was right. That's the moment I felt something shift, not fear exactly, but unease. The kind that makes you double-check your own memory. Patients can overhear things. Observers talk. Clocks are visible. There are explanations. Still, I pulled the observer aside and asked if she'd spoken to him. She hadn't. I asked if she'd read him the chart. She looked offended. "We don't do that." The rest of the night passed without incident. No more speech. No movement. Morning psych evaluated him and confirmed catatonia. They started treatment. Over the next 2 days, he gradually became responsive. Slow speech. Limited affect. "No memory," he said, "of the first night." Before discharge, I asked him carefully if he remembered saying anything when he first arrived. He shook his head. Said the first clear memory he had was sunlight through the window on day 2. I should have let it go there. A week later, during an internal audit, my incident report about the medication room came up. Risk management wanted clarification on how the door had been left unsecured. I reviewed my notes before the meeting. That's when I noticed the intake timestamp. The system showed I had charted the verbalization at 3:16 a.m., but the audit log showed the entry had been created at 3:12. 4 minutes earlier, I checked every other timestamp from that shift. They all lined up with my memory. Only that one was off. I asked IT if it was a glitch. They said no changes had been made. No edits. No corrections. Officially, the discrepancy was attributed to system lag. Unofficially, I stopped taking night admissions for a while. I still work there. I still do my job the same way. But when someone comes in unresponsive now, eyes open, breathing steady, I'm more careful with what I say out loud. And I never assume that just because someone can't move or speak, they aren't paying attention to the timing of things. I didn't write this one down until years later, and even then I left parts out. Not because it was dramatic, but because it didn't fit anywhere cleanly in our language for incidents. There was no code for it. At the time I was working as night staff on a behavioral health observation unit. Different hospital. Smaller facility. 6 beds, all locked, all under continuous monitoring. I'd been there just over 7 years. My shift ran from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m. And my role was mostly supervision, watching monitors, coordinating with techs, stepping in if restraints or seclusion were required. By policy, we were supposed to be background noise, present but not intrusive. That night, the unit was unusually quiet. No new intakes after midnight. Everyone medicated, settled. The kind of shift where you catch up on documentation and count the hours by coffee refills. At 1:32 a.m., one of the techs flagged room 5 for review. The patient had been admitted earlier that evening under a temporary hold. Female, late 20s. Severe depressive episode with dissociative features. No substances. No psychosis noted in the ED assessment. She'd been tearful during intake, but cooperative, articulate. By the time she reached us though, she'd gone almost entirely still. The tech noted that she hadn't changed position in over 40 minutes. I checked the monitor. She was lying on her side, knees slightly drawn up, eyes closed, breathing slow but even. Nothing that would usually trigger intervention. Still, I walked down the hall to do an in-person check. We're trained not to assume sleep when dissociation is on the differential. I stood just inside the doorway and said her name softly. No response. Louder. Nothing. I watched her chest for a full minute. Counted breaths. Everything normal. I started to leave when I noticed her eyes were open, not suddenly. Not dramatically. They were already open. I just hadn't registered it at first because they weren't focused on anything. They were angled downward, unfixed, like she was staring through the mattress. I said her name again. No reaction. I asked if she could hear me. No blink. No shift. I documented her as dissociative, possibly catatonic, and placed her on enhanced observation checks every 10 minutes instead of 15. At 2:04 a.m., the tech documented, patient remains still, eyes open. At 2:14, no change. At 2:24, I checked again, same position, same open eyes. This time, I spoke a little longer. Explained where she was. Told her it was night staff, that she was safe. Sometimes grounding helps. Sometimes it doesn't. As I turned to go, she whispered, "You don't have to stand there." I stopped, asked her to repeat it. She didn't. Her eyes closed slowly, deliberately, like someone choosing sleep. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I reviewed the footage later. On camera, it looked like nothing. No visible mouth movement. No change in posture. Just stillness. At 2:37 a.m., the tech wrote, "Patient appears asleep." At 2:51, she rang the call light. That in itself wasn't unusual, but what she said was, when the tech answered, the patient asked, "Is it still Tuesday?" It was Wednesday. The tech corrected her gently. The patient paused, then said, "Then I missed it." When asked what she meant, she didn't respond. She lay back down, eyes closed. I went in again. Asked her what she thought she'd missed. She looked at me for the first time since admission. Her gaze was steady now, clear. "You already did it," she said. "That's why it feels wrong." I asked her what felt wrong. She shook her head slightly, like she'd said too much. Then she turned her face to the wall and went quiet again. The rest of the night passed without incident. No agitation. No further speech. Morning assessment found her withdrawn, but responsive. She denied hallucinations. Denied confusion. Denied remembering most of the night. She was discharged 3 days later with a diagnosis that didn't surprise anyone. What stayed with me happened during chart review. Her observation log showed a call light activation at 2:51 a.m., but the system audit showed the button had been pressed at 2:48. 3 minutes earlier, I checked the footage. At 2:48, her hand was still. No movement. No reach. Toward the panel. I brought it up to IT. They suggested a delay in system logging. The explanation fit just well enough to close the issue. I didn't push it. What I couldn't explain was the feeling I had for the rest of that shift and for many nights. After that, something important had already happened without me noticing. Not a crisis. Not an emergency. Just a moment I'd somehow arrived too late to witness. I still work nights. Still trust the monitors. Still rely on documentation. But I no longer assume that when a patient seems absent, the absence is empty. I was already tired before this one started, which matters more than people admit. Fatigue changes how you file things away in your head. What you dismiss, what you don't. At the time, I was a mental health technician on a long-term psychiatric ward. Locked unit, mixed acuity, mostly patients who'd been there weeks or months. I'd been in that role just over 5 years, mostly evening and overnight shifts. My responsibilities were hands-on checks, de-escalation, assisting with hygiene, documenting behavior, sitting one-to-one when needed. You learn the patient's rhythms, who sleeps lightly, who talks in their sleep, who never sleeps at all. This happened on a swing shift that ran late. I stayed on past midnight to cover a staffing gap. By 12:30 a.m., the ward had settled into its usual nighttime quiet. Lights dimmed, hallway empty. Just the low hum of ventilation and the occasional cough from behind a door. Room 7 was assigned to a middle-aged man who'd been admitted for severe psychomotor retardation following a prolonged depressive episode. He wasn't new. He'd been on the unit almost 3 weeks. Barely spoke. Barely moved. Not catatonic by definition, but close enough that we watched him carefully. No aggression, no self-harm, just absence. At 12:47 a.m., I did my round. Room 7, patient lying on his back, eyes closed, hands folded loosely on his abdomen, breathing steady. I marked him as resting. At 1:02 a.m., same. At 1:17, I noticed something small. His hands weren't folded the same way. One finger, his left index, was extended, the rest curled in. That happens. People shift. I noted it mentally, not on paper. At 1:31, I passed again, same position, same finger extended. This time his eyes were open, not wide, not startled. Just open enough that I could see the whites catching the hallway light. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking anywhere in particular. I said his name quietly. No response. I asked if he needed anything. Nothing. I stepped inside, close enough to see his chest rise. Normal, I told him the time. Sometimes orientation helps. Sometimes it doesn't. As I turned to leave, he said, "You already checked." I stopped, looked back at him. His mouth hadn't moved much. The words came out slow, careful, like he was choosing each one. I said yes, that I'd just done a round. Asked if he remembered. He nodded, once. That was the one that counted, he said. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. His eyes closed again, smoothly, like a decision had been made. I documented the interaction brief, verbalization, oriented to person, unclear to time, nothing alarming, no need to escalate. At 2 a.m., the unit alarm chimed for routine vitals on another patient. I helped, returned to the desk, caught up on notes. The night went on. At 3:12 a.m., I did another round. Room 7 looked exactly the same as before. Same position, same finger extended. Eyes closed. I marked him as resting. At 3:27, I passed again. Something felt wrong immediately, but I couldn't have said why. He hadn't moved. That was the problem. People always move, even in sleep. A shoulder shift, a jaw twitch, something. I stepped inside and said his name louder this time. No response. I touched his shoulder warm. Normal. I checked his breathing more closely. Still there. Slow, shallow, but there. Relief came first, then confusion. His eyes opened. He looked directly at me. "You missed it," he said. I asked what he meant. My voice sounded too loud in the room. "The space," he said, "between." I asked if he was in pain, if he needed medical. He shook his head slowly. "You can't write it," he added. "That's why they let me keep it." I stood there longer than protocol suggests. Long enough to feel that strange pressure you get when you know you should leave, but don't yet understand why. Eventually, I stepped out and closed the door. The rest of the shift passed without incident. Morning handoff noted no changes. Psych rounds later that day described him as minimally responsive. Baseline. A week later, during routine chart reconciliation, I noticed something off. There was no entry for my 117 round. I knew I'd done it. I could picture it. The finger, the light on the wall, the exact spot I'd stood. But the log jumped from 102 to 131. I asked the charge nurse if entries ever failed to save. She said rarely, but it happened. I accepted that explanation. Still, from that night on, I became meticulous about rounds, double-checking timestamps, making sure nothing fell between entries. Because every so often when I pass a room where someone lies perfectly still, eyes open, I get the uneasy sense that something important can happen in the gaps we don't think to. Documenting that the patient may be more aware of those gaps than we are. I remember this one starting with paperwork. That's usually how the ones that bother me most begin, not with a patient, but with a form that doesn't sit right. I was working as an observation unit supervisor then, early 40s. Over 15 years in psychiatric facilities by that point. This was a short-stay crisis stabilization unit attached to an urban hospital. Patients were supposed to be with us no more than 72 hours. My shift that night ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I handled bed assignments, monitored higher-risk cases, reviewed overnight documentation, and stepped in when something drifted outside protocol. At 11:38 p.m., I reviewed the census before midnight checks. 5 patients, 4 rooms occupied. 1 patient listed as temporary hold awaiting reassessment. Room 2, I paused on that entry longer than I should have. The admission time was listed as 6:52 a.m. that same morning. That meant the patient had been on the unit for nearly 17 hours without reassessment. Not impossible, but unusual for this unit. I made a note to follow up in the morning. During the first round, just after midnight, everything seemed normal. Room 2, patient lying on the bed, blanket pulled to chest, eyes closed, male, early 50s. I recognized him vaguely, not by face, but by posture. The kind of stillness you see in people who are trying very hard not to be noticed. I checked the observation log. He was on 15-minute checks. Notes were consistent. Resting. No change, no behavioral flags. At 12:44 a.m., one of the techs approached me and asked a simple question. "Is room 2 supposed to be here tonight?" I asked what she meant. She said she thought he'd been discharged earlier in the evening. She remembered escorting someone who looked like him toward intake around dinner time. Memory errors happen. Long shifts blur together. I told her she was mistaken and went back to the monitors. At 1:03 a.m., I noticed something small on the camera feed. Room 2's patient was no longer lying flat. He was turned slightly toward the door, eyes open, watching. I zoomed in. His expression was neutral, not distressed, not agitated, just attentive. I went down the hall to do a direct check. I said his name from the chart. No response. I asked if he knew where he was. Nothing. I told him the time, the unit, the plan for reassessment in the morning. Standard orientation. As I turned to leave, he said quietly, "They already asked me that." I stopped and asked who had asked him. He didn't answer. His eyes closed again. I documented the verbalization and continued rounds. At 2:17 a.m., during a routine chart review, I noticed something I hadn't before. His admission note didn't include an admitting clinician's signature. There was a name typed in, but no electronic verification. That shouldn't have passed review. I checked the ED transfer note. It ended abruptly. No discharge summary, no clear handoff. At 2:34 a.m., I called down to the emergency department to clarify. The charge nurse there sounded confused. She put me on hold longer than necessary. When she came back, she said, "We don't have anyone by that name here. Not today." I asked if they'd had him earlier. She said she'd check. While waiting, I glanced at the monitor again. Room 2 was empty. The bed was neatly made. No patient. No blanket disturbance. Nothing. I went down the hall immediately. Opened the door. The room was exactly as it appeared on camera, clean, unused, reset the way housekeeping leaves it after discharge. I checked the observation log. All previous entries for room 2 were still there. Times, notes, initials. I checked the census again. Room 2 was no longer listed. No discharge time. No transfer note. Just gone. At 2:41 a.m., the ed called back. The charge nurse sounded unsettled now. She said there had been a patient with that name earlier in the day. He had been pronounced dead at 6:31 a.m. Cardiac arrest in the emergency department. Never transferred upstairs. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I asked her to repeat the time. She did. I ended the call and sat there, staring at the screen. All documentation for room 2 vanished during the system refresh at 3 a.m. Every note, every check, the admission entry itself, except one thing. My verbalization note at 1:04 a.m. remained, flagged as an orphaned entry with no associated patient record. Risk management later told me it was a system error caused by a duplicate chart ID. That explanation closed the case. I still think about the way he looked at the door before he disappeared. Not frightened, not confused, just waiting, like someone making sure they were finally in the right place to be noticed. This one is harder to place in time, which is usually how I know it mattered. The details aren't dramatic. That's part of the problem. Nothing happened in the way incident reports are written to capture, but something shifted, and I noticed it only because of what failed to shift back. I was working 1-2-1 observation that night. Not my usual assignment. A patient had been escalated earlier in the evening, and staffing was thin, so I took the chair outside his room. Locked adult unit. Older building. Thick doors with narrow safety windows. This was my 10th year working inpatient, and by then I'd sat more 1-2-1s than I could count. The patient was in his late 40s. Voluntary admission that had quietly turned involuntary after he stopped engaging. History of major depressive disorder, complicated grief, long stretches of psychomotor slowing. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't suicidal in any overt way. He just withdrew, stopped responding, stopped eating unless prompted, stopped acknowledging the room. At 11:06 p.m., he was placed on constant observation due to concerns about internal preoccupation. That phrase gets used when we don't have better language yet. My job was simple: stay seated, maintain line of sight, document every 15 minutes, intervene if he attempted to harm himself or deteriorated medically. No phone, no distractions. The room light was dimmed. He lay on his back, hands resting at his sides, eyes open. At 11:15 p.m., I charted, patient awake, eyes open, no verbal response. At 11:30, same. At 11:45, I noticed his lips moving, not forming words, just slight motion, like someone counting under their breath or repeating something silently. I stood, leaned closer to the window, listened. Nothing audible. I knocked softly and asked if he was trying to say something. No response. The lip movement stopped immediately. I documented it as possible subvocalization. That's the term we're taught to use. At 12:04 a.m., he spoke. You don't have to watch this part. I felt my posture change before I was aware of it. I asked him what he meant. Asked if he was in pain. Asked if he needed the nurse. He shook his head once, very slightly. This already happened, he said. You're just here, so it lines up. That's the kind of sentence that, in hindsight, feels loaded. At the time, it sounded like depressive rumination. Fixed beliefs. Nothing delusional enough to escalate. I responded the way we're trained to. Reflected feeling. Offered support. He didn't react. His eyes stayed on the ceiling. At 12:22 a.m., the nurse came by to check vitals. Blood pressure normal. Pulse low, but within his baseline. Oxygen saturation fine. She asked him to squeeze her fingers. He didn't. She asked if he could hear her. No response. She looked at me, eyebrows raised, and shrugged. Same as earlier, she said, and left. At 12:37, his eyes closed. Not like sleep. Slow, deliberate, as if he were shutting something down. At 12:52, I charted him as eyes closed, appears resting. At 1:07 a.m., he opened them again. This time, he looked straight at me through the window. You missed the middle, he said. I asked what middle. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. The quiet part, he replied. It was better without witnesses. Then his gaze drifted past me, unfocused again. There were no further verbalizations after that. No movement. No crisis. At 2 a.m., his observation level was downgraded back to 15-minute checks due to stability. I handed off to the tech and went back to the desk. In the morning, during chart review, his overnight notes looked normal to normal. My entries were there, but one line was missing. The 12:37 entry, when his eyes closed, was gone. I checked timestamps. The entries before and after were intact. No edits, no deletions logged. When I mentioned it to the charge nurse, she said, if it's not there, it probably didn't save. That was the end of the discussion. The patient was discharged 2 days later. He was more responsive then, polite, flat. He thanked staff individually. When he reached me, he paused. You did fine, he said. Most people don't sit all the way through. I didn't ask what he meant. Since then, I've done hundreds more observation shifts. I sit the same way. I document carefully. I follow protocol. But there's a part of me that no longer believes constant observation means constant awareness. And when someone tells me they don't need to be watched for a moment, I pay closer attention to when they say it. I've signed more confidentiality forms than I can count, but this one, I'm not even sure which form covers it. My name was on the observation log. That's the part I keep coming back to. My initials, clear as day, in the blue ink pen I always used, next to the 15-minute check mark, and the time written beside it, 2:11 a.m. On the forensic unit, nights were about rhythm. The soft hum of the corridor lights, the whisper of the security door at the nurse's station, the distant, rhythmic pacing from room 12. Room 12 was Mr. Claiborne, catatonic schizophrenia. He'd been with us for 7 months. He never spoke. He never made eye contact. His file described a waxy flexibility. You could pose his limbs, and they'd stay there for hours. Most nights, he'd stand by his bed, one hand resting on the wall, facing the corner. He'd stand like that from the end of the evening med round until the sun came up. My job, every 15 minutes, was to walk the hall, shine my pen light through the observation slit in his door, confirm he was breathing and stationary, and log it. It was the easiest check on the ward. That night, the rhythm broke. At At 1:30, he was standing. At 1:45, he was standing. At 2 o'clock, I did my round. I looked through the slit. He was standing. I initialed the log for 2 o'clock. I remember pausing at the nurse's station to sip cold coffee, listening to the radio traffic from the security office downstairs. Then I walked back down the hall for the 2:15 check. Routine. I put my eye to the slit in his door. His bed was empty. He wasn't in his usual spot by the wall. He was right there, standing directly on the other side of the door, his face an inch from the glass, staring straight at me. His eyes were focused, present, and utterly vacant all at once. I jolted back. My heart was a hammer against my ribs. It wasn't the surprise of movement. Catatonic patients can move, sometimes suddenly. It was the precision of it. He had moved, silently, across the room in a window of less than 15 minutes, and he had placed himself exactly where he knew I would look. I fumbled with my keys, opened the door. He didn't react. I said his name. Nothing. His arm was still slightly raised, as if still touching the wall he'd left behind. I guided him back to his bed, my hand on his elbow. He offered no resistance, no guidance, just inert weight. I settled him, did a quick physical check. All normal. I backed out, locked the door, and went to the log. That's when I saw it. Next to the 2:11 a.m. check, a check I had not yet performed. My initials were already there. In my blue pen, the same slightly ragged capital R I always made. The entry was complete. Time initials, the code for patient stationary. But I had been at the station at 2:11. I hadn't touched the log. I looked at my pen, clipped to my scrubs. I looked back at the book. The ink was dry. I checked the previous pages, my entries from earlier in the week. The handwriting, it was mine. It was indisputably mine. I stood there for a long time. Then I did the only thing I could think to do. I drew a line through the 2:11 entry, wrote patient mobile, repositioned and initialed it again, right next to the ghost entry. 2 sets of my own initials, minutes apart. I never reported it. What would I say? That the log was pre-filled? That a man who hadn't spoken in 7 months anticipated my routine down to the minute and mirrored my own handwriting? They'd have sent me for a psych eval. Mr. Claiborne resumed his position by the wall the next night, and never moved from it again. He was transferred out a month later. I still have the logbook page, a photocopy I shouldn't have made. I don't look for ghosts in it. I look for the mistake. The proof that I was tired, that I autopiloted the entry, that my memory is flawed, but the timeline doesn't work. The pen doesn't work. The horror isn't that something impossible happened on the ward. The horror is that the most meticulous proof we have, the documentation, can lie, and it can lie in your own hand. It makes you wonder what else you've signed for without knowing.